Hello and welcome to CWJah Talk. This is episode number 4, where we are going to discuss Jesus, his teaching about the Golden Rule, and Confucius, and what his teachings were, and how they were similar to Jesus' teachings with regard to how we should treat other people. Also today, what we're going to discuss is a text in the book of Romans, where Paul writes about people who, even though they do not do things by law in the same way that the Jews perform the law in accordance with what they received from Moses, that they were a law, or that they could be, people of the nations could be a law to themselves. So what I want to do is I want to introduce Jesus' teaching on the Golden Rule first, exactly what that is, and the texts that are from his life and teachings, the best sources of his life and teachings, and then see what he has to say, compare that with what is attributed to Confucius and to Confucianism, Chinese philosophy, and talk a little bit about him, and then try to understand both teachings in light of what Paul taught in Romans about how people of the nations, even though not having a law, can be a law to themselves. And so I believe what we're going to see is in Confucius, as an example, is a fulfillment of how people of the nations, meaning non-Jews in the context of our discussion about biblical documents, in the first century, could still be accepted by Jah, or be viewed by him as though they were serving him similar to the way the Jews did by following the law. So the way that Jah and Jesus are able to judge people is different than how we can judge people. We can see when somebody breaks a law. We can see when somebody goes outside of a regulation. But we have a much more difficult time. In fact, we can rarely ever read a person's heart. We can sometimes get to know them and, of course, in a sense, get to know their inner person. But when it comes to their true motive and their genuine internal disposition, this is something that only Jah and those appointed by him can truly see. So we'll see how that relates, if at all, to this comparison we're going to make between Jesus' Golden Rule and what is attributed to Confucius. I keep saying attributed to Confucius because Confucius himself lived in the 6th century BCE, but it's not always the case that what we have that is attributed to him, it has a direct or even an indirect connection with his writings and with what we know about him. They're not inconsistent, but for example, what we're going to consider today, even in the text that I have, the source book in Chinese philosophy, that quotes the doctrine of the mean, a section. Confucius' writings and the writings attributed either to Confucius or to persons like his grandson in the 5th century, or to various commentators from anywhere from the 2nd century BCE all the way into the Middle Ages and beyond. But it appears that the source for the text, or the information we're going to actually read today from the doctrine of the mean, part of Confucianism or attributed to Confucius philosophy, is it appears to be attributed to a commentary written in the 2nd to late 2nd or 3rd century CE. So while we will be talking about it as a teaching of Confucius, it does not necessarily mean that it is one of his teachings. So for example, we're going to be reading in a moment from the book of Matthew and Mark and Luke. So those are accounts either written by eyewitnesses or people who interviewed eyewitnesses alive at the time and collected all the information and prepared it into this narrative. And so you would have secondhand information. Well, you'd have direct witness information by some, and then, for example, Luke, you would have secondhand information given to him in the best case scenario by those who actually witnessed what Jesus said and taught. Well, with Confucius, that's not the case. With Confucius, at best, we have third, fourth, or further removed sources that contain information that either they or later writers attribute to Confucius. So it's important to keep that in mind. And I will give you a reference in a moment in the text that I'm going to read that gives you, I think, a good footnote if you're interested, at least as far as the text we're going to read today from the Doctrine of the Mean. And then if you want to look at the textual basis for it, feel free to do so. So I don't claim to be an expert, of course, on Chinese literature and textual, the textual history of it, but I do know something about Confucius and the texts that he wrote and that are similar to what Jesus taught. I've spent some time, as I've been going over in this introduction, so that I do understand the textual history as it relates to what I'm going to be referring to. And as I mentioned, it's not always as linear or clear when it comes to identifying where these quotations or teachings come from. But we're going to attribute them to Confucius today and not get too caught up into the actual source of the things we're going to read from the Doctrine of the Mean. But I'm going to start out with Jesus. So let me do that. I'm going to read the 3 New Testament accounts for which, as I've mentioned in prior broadcasts, we have significant and credible textual documents and transmission history, various languages. And of course, we read in the New Testament documents themselves. Even people from places like Ethiopia were reading texts of the Bible and then learning Christianity and then taking that with them and spreading it out throughout the world. So it's not a surprise, but we have a tremendous history and a rich heritage of New Testament manuscripts and material to draw from. So I'm not going to spend as much time going over it as I did on Confucius, because most people know about what we have available today in the New Testament, whereas Confucius and the sources of his writings are not as well known. And so I'm going to start in Matthew chapter 22, and then I will move to Mark chapter 12, and then down to Luke chapter 10. I'm going to read all 3 directly. I may make a comment here or there, but otherwise I'm going to get clear in mind the teaching of Jesus on this point, the golden rule, and what it actually is. All right, so starting with Matthew chapter 22, I'm going to read verses 34 through 40. And there it reads, "Now the Pharisees heard that he silenced the Sadducees, so they came together around him. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question in order to test him. 'Teacher, what command is most important in the entire law?' Then Jesus said to him, 'You must love Lord Jehovah, your God, with all your heart and with all your life and with all your mind. This is the great and first command. But the second one is like the first, namely, you must love your neighbor as you love yourself. The entire law and the writings of the prophets depend on these 2 commands.'" Now, the second command is the one we're going to focus on today. And I'm reading from my own translation, and I bracketed the word Jehovah after Lord, because in the New Testament text, there's what is called a nomina sacra, or an abbreviation for a sacred name that was originally in the text and that has been substituted, not just because it's a New Testament document, but because here what we'll refer to as the Old Testament was quoted, where it contains the divine name. All source material that we have available from the New Testament, period, time when this would have been quoted, shows that whether it was the Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek text, a form of the divine name was in it, not a nomina sacra. But at some point, a substitution was made, probably because of the persecutions that ensued following Jesus' death. So, but today's not about the divine name or even about the first command, but I included it because it's a part of Jesus' response. And it shows how important treating each other the way we want to be treated is. It's right next to worshiping Jah with our whole heart, soul, and mind. And in verse 40, Jesus says the entire law and the writings of the prophets depend upon these two commands. Now that's very significant because essentially what Jesus is saying here is that all of the things written in the laws of Moses or in the prophets, which were much earlier than the first century, were essentially following these two commands. And so, as we'll discuss in a moment, it's not that big of a surprise that similar beliefs and philosophies were also practiced by people such as the Chinese. So, because the point that I'm making here is that Jesus is essentially saying these two commands have been in operation for a long time. I'm just simplifying them. I'm making it easy for you to see and do. And so what he does is he quotes the first command from Deuteronomy 6:5 and the second that we're focused on today from Leviticus 19:18. Okay, so now let's read Mark chapter 12, verses 28 through 31. Again, I'm reading from my translation, so again, I use the divine name and quotations from the Hebrew or Old Testament scriptures because I believe that's where it is in all the existing manuscripts that would have been available for Jesus or anyone in the first century to quote at this time. All right, so moving past that issue, but just so you understand as I read it, and getting to the second command is what we're focused on. So Mark chapter 12, 28 through 31. Then came one of the grammarians, who heard them as they were arguing. Seeing that Jesus answered them well, the grammarian asked him, "Which command is the most important of all?" Jesus answered, "The most important command is, you must hear, Israel. Lord Jehovah, our God, Lord Jehovah is one. And you must love Lord Jehovah, your God, from your whole heart and from your whole soul and from your complete mind and from your entire strength." Okay, now verse 31, Mark chapter 12. The second most important command is this: you must love the person near you or your neighbor as yourself. There is not another command greater than these two. Let me repeat that just because, we can get caught up in the other parts of the text because they're so important as well. There is not another command greater than these two. Okay, these are two of our three things. The third thing that we believe and that we actually, where we put it in terms of priority, in accepting Jesus, we believe that that's just our number two belief because we believe it encompasses everything he's teaching us here about the two commands he refers to as the greatest. He's not including himself. That's my point. So the importance with regard to these two does not lessen the importance of Jesus as our third belief, of course, because as Christians we're obligated to confess him as the Christ. That's why we're Christians. We believe he fulfilled the law of Moses and the prophets, and that he did these two things better than anyone. Because even if Confucius, as we'll read a little bit later, taught something similar and lived that way, lived to be, a good person and was consistent with what he said and how he acted, he did not, to our knowledge, praise Jah. It doesn't mean, though, that he didn't, or that in some way we are not fully familiar with, in terms of Chinese culture and history, understand how Jesus or Jah would have worked through the law in the hearts of anyone who didn't directly worship them. That's for them to determine, as we'll talk about a little bit later. But let me get to this third account that we have of the Golden Rule, according to Jesus, in the records we have in the Bible. So now I'm going to read from Luke chapter 10, verses 25 through 28. And there it says, "Suddenly, a certain lawyer got up from where he was sitting in order to test Jesus, saying, 'Teacher, by doing what will I inherit everlasting life?' Then Jesus said to him, 'What has been written in the law? How do you read openly when answering this question?' Then the lawyer answered and said, 'You must love Lord Jehovah, your God, from your whole heart, and with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind. And you must love your neighbor as yourself.' So Jesus said to him, 'You answered correctly. Do what you just said, and you will live.'" Okay, so those are the three accounts that we have of Jesus expressing the golden rule: loving your neighbor as yourself, loving the one near you as yourself. That is what we have the earliest records telling us Jesus taught. Okay, and then we have Confucius' version, what I'll call a version. I'm not saying he necessarily got it from here or one got it from the other. I'm going to call it a version only because it's not as commonly known or talked about as the golden rule we just referred to, that Jesus just stated, at least according to three separate accounts that are well preserved, well documented textually, and that essentially say exactly the same thing. You must love your neighbor as yourself. So now let's compare that with what Confucius, or what has been attributed to Confucius, says. So this is from the Doctrine of the Mean. They divided up these different commentaries and collections of earlier references and works and commentaries on the quotations in earlier works. They divided them at some point, I believe around the 2nd century, into different sections. And so one of the sections is the Doctrine of the Mean. It might have been later when that division occurred, but in any case, our quotation today, or the source material, appears to be most likely from the early 2nd to late 2nd or 3rd century in a commentary regarding Confucius. But even some later writers about this text believe that it was actually Confucius' grandson. So again, you're not going to get a clear history or historical viewpoint in reviewing the literature regarding it. But the point is that this is what's attributed to Confucius, to Confucianism, and it's consistent with various philosophies that have been a part of Chinese and Eastern culture for hundreds of years, if not thousands, at least 1,000 or more. So, in reading from the Doctrine of the Mean, section 13, let me start. I'm going to read from this point. So here's what it says. "Conscientiousness and altruism are not far from the way. What you do not wish others to do to you, do not do to them." Now, that's often referred to as the negative form of the golden rule, right? Because in Jesus' references, or in the references to Jesus in his version of the golden rule, what he stated, it's you must love. There's an active component to what he's talking about. You must do this as you would want it done to yourself, or as you would do it to yourself. But here he says, do not do to others what you do not wish them to do to you. So it's been viewed as somewhat more of a passive teaching. But inherently, I think if we're even stating a principle like this negatively, as we're reading about here in the Doctrine of the Mean, I still think it involves inherently an active component as well. Because things that you choose not to do to others often can involve activity, right? I mean, Jesus' illustration of the Samaritan who was beaten. And so no one would want that done to us, right? So the person who ended up helping the beaten Samaritan is someone who could have, in Confucius' way, just said, well, you know, I wouldn't want that done to me, and I didn't do it to him. But it was more than that. It was the fact that what he didn't want done to him happened to someone else. And so the principle that you could attribute in a Confucian way, a negative way, the way it's stated, do not do to others what you don't want them to do to you, you could still apply it to the account that Jesus gave about that Samaritan being beaten and then helped, the neighborly Samaritan. By showing that in not acting certain ways towards others, when you see that principle being violated, it has there's an inherent response to react because of the value of the principle you live by. And so I think it becomes an activity when you are faced with circumstances like the illustration that Jesus gave about the neighborly Samaritan and the way that different people treated the person who was attacked. So I'm not so sure that just in stating it negatively, we really have that much of a difference. But oftentimes people refer to it that way. Now, going on a little bit further, you're actually going to see that Confucius gives more than just a negative statement of the Golden Rule. Okay, so let me read just a little bit more. And I think this will be helpful to appreciate what we're going to talk about in a moment from Romans chapter 2. So let me get through this little section here on Confucius, tie it together with the Golden Rule, and then let's go to Romans, see what Paul says, and then I'm going to open it up to your questions. So he goes on to say, to serve my father as I would expect my son to serve me, that I have not been able to do. To serve my ruler as I would expect my ministers to serve me, that I have not been able to do. To serve my elder brothers as I would expect my younger brother to serve me, that I have not been able to do. To be the first to treat friends as I would expect them to treat me, that I have not been able to do. So you can see here that, to be the first to treat friends as I would expect them to treat me. He goes on to say he hasn't been able to do it or really master it. I'm sure he had instances where that was something he could do. And so he actually does give, you could say, both a positive and negative form of the rule, because as I mentioned, I don't think you could just have a passive form of this kind of standard, where in treating others the way you want to be treated, or not treating others the way you don't want them to treat you, then when you see that principle violated in someone else, if that's the principle you truly live by, it's going to cause you to defend it. To what extent you're able to respond. But I don't think a person who lives by either a positive or negative form of the Golden Rule would be able to refrain from stepping in to assist somebody who's being abused or attacked in a way that if they were abused or attacked, they wouldn't expect somebody else to assist. And so it involves much more than this simple, well, is that something I would want done to me? Yes or no? Okay, that's my answer. There's more to it than that. I'm not saying it's more complicated. I'm just saying that there are situations where we may not do something to somebody else that we wouldn't want them to do to us, but where we see something done to them that, even though it doesn't directly involve us, it involves the standard that we accept and believe in. And so we'll risk our lives for it, right? What does Jesus say? He who gives his life for his friend or his brother, no one has greater love than this, right? Because you're willing to step in and do something for that person, even if it means your life, because that's what you would expect of them. It may not happen. Not everyone actually comes through, especially in your hour of need. But if that's your standard, then you will be beyond reproach, right? Even if you're betrayed and you believe in Jah and Jesus, and you know they're watching, they're evaluating your conduct and the way you go about talking to people, handling situations, that's where our perspective should be. Now, that doesn't mean we ignorantly walk into situations where we know people have ill intention. Sometimes having a golden rule standard like this can make us vulnerable to people with bad intentions. But let me, before we get to that, tie in this idea of the law in our hearts. Okay, so we have the golden rule, well established. 3 of the 4 first century credible New Testament accounts of Jesus' life and teachings clearly tell us the 2 most important things. And they're 2 of our 3 things, the third of which is Jesus himself. So then we have the positive, negative form of essentially the same principle. Do to others what you would want them to do to you, or do not do to others what you don't want them to do to you, expressed and attributed to Confucianism and to Confucius, or those related to him. So those are very similar, I mean, if not the same, right? We have people, we have Jesus, we have people before Jesus following the law of Moses, which he said, if they did, then essentially they were fulfilling these 2 things in most respects. And so we have people in China, Confucius, and several dynasties of people influenced by the same principle, the same golden rule, essentially. Okay, now let's take a look at what Paul says in Romans. And in Romans chapter 2, we know that in Romans, Paul talks a lot about the law and what it means to be righteous before God. And in the first century, a big issue was this being made righteous before God in terms of the law or in terms of faith in Jesus, the Messiah. So then that naturally begs the question, well, okay, if we have a measure of righteousness in the law and we have a measure of righteousness in Jesus, the Christians, and then the Jews have a measure of righteousness in Moses and in the prophets, then what are other people measured by, right? How are other people to be made righteous or to have a relationship with God if they're not Jewish and they're not a part of the Christian community, even if we extended it to Gentiles, right? So if we extended it to all the Gentiles who had been receiving and learning of the message, and many of whom also knew of the Jewish laws and prophet texts. But what about the ones in other parts of the world, like China, that aren't described really in detail in terms of the missionary work and accepting and living by the golden rule type principle? So even though we have indications they had that kind of rule, how are we to show they can? How are we to explain the righteousness that God offers through the law and through Christ to people who, even though they have a similar principle or standard, do not know Jah, are not educated in that principle through the law or through the Christians? Paul talks about this. He discusses it in Romans chapter 2. Now, let me read Romans chapter 2, verses 13 through 16. And then I'm going to make my application, and then I'm going to turn it over to all of you. Good morning. Good morning, Benzie Roy. Good morning, Betsy. Thank you all again for joining me. So we're in our discussion on the Golden Rule. This is CWJah Talk number 4. It's a Saturday talk show, live show, where we have a discussion with people online. And based on communications I've received, either notes and YouTube comments or emails, letters, I get correspondence all the time. Of course, I can't read and respond to all of it, but I can include some of it in these videos and try to cover a material and give people something to think about that I hope is worthwhile. So this discussion about the Golden Rule is meant to highlight the third thing that Christian witnesses of Jah believe. We have 3 primary beliefs. We accept the biblical God Jah as the eternal life who gave life to all life. We believe Jesus is the Messiah, the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. We have texts such as in the Dead Sea Scrolls that were written before Jesus was even born that talk about the things that he later did and that we read about by other writers. Independent, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Different accounts, detailed accounts with credible textual history. And then our third primary belief is treating others the way we want to be treated. And we read 3 texts where Jesus said this was the second greatest command next to loving the CWJah with our whole heart, soul, and mind. And then we read from some of the literature attributed to Confucius, a Chinese philosopher who lived in the 6th century BCE, and in some of the works attributed to him is a similar statement to the effect that you should both not do to others what you don't want them to do to you, and treat others the way you want to be treated. Very similar to what Jesus said. So then we got into the discussion of how then, if Christians are made righteous through knowledge of the Christ and the law that we follow, treating us the way we want to be treated, accepting him and worshiping Jah, and the Jews try to attain righteousness before God by following the law and the prophets. Well, what about all these other peoples? So that brought us to Romans chapter 2. Romans chapter 2, verses 13 through 16. Here's what it says. For the hearers of law are not the ones righteous before God, but the doers of law will be declared righteous. For whenever people of the nations that do not have law do by nature the things of the law, these people, although not having law, are a law to themselves. They are the very ones who demonstrate the matter of the law to be written in their hearts, while their conscience is bearing witness with them. And between their own thoughts, they are being accused or even excused. Final verse, verse 16. This will be in the day when God, through Christ Jesus, judges the secret things of mankind, according to the good news I declare. So that text from Romans I read from the New World Translation. Obviously, I'm very familiar with it. So often I'll read from the New World Translation, and just like I'd read from any other translation. The other texts were from my translation, from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But in this case, so that's why it says good news instead of great message in 16. In any case, the text is fine the way it stands for now. And as you can see, let's take a look at that again real quickly. So we have people then who are not made righteous through direct Christian exposure and or by attempting to attain righteousness through the law, at least during that time when the temple still stood. And so Paul refers to them, and he speaks of their conscience, bearing witness with them between their thoughts, a place we can never go. And in that place, inside their minds, in what we call their heart, their figurative heart, what their deep thoughts are, inside, they're being accused or even excused. And this is in the day when God, through Christ Jesus, judges the secret things. We don't do that. So on the one hand, obviously, we don't embrace Confucianism. Confucianism isn't just the Golden Rule or a form of it. Confucianism involves, well, I mean, as I said, it's difficult to clearly define exactly what we could say Confucius, or what to attribute to Confucius. But based on what we have and what the literature states, Confucius may have been into things like astrology. He certainly had an understanding of heaven and that judgment could come from heaven, it appears. And so it's similar to other Chinese philosophies or Neo-Confucianism. But I wouldn't put it in the category of biblical thought necessarily. There are a lot of things in what he writes that are wise and that have application and that aren't a problem. But there are also a lot of unclear teachings or vague references to heaven that in our view are much clearer in terms of coming from the CWJah. So, nevertheless, even though we don't embrace it as a system of belief, that's what Paul's talking about, right? He's talking about people of the nations who do not have law, but who by nature do the things of the law and are a law to themselves. So, at the same time, while we would always share information with people who are willing and open, we have to understand that Jah is very much aware of what people are thinking, what they do, what we do. And he and Jesus are very capable of determining whether or not a person is responding according to the law written in their hearts, like Paul says here in verse 15, or whether they are responding to the great message, direct exposure to Jesus, or even in reading Moses and the prophets, and then ultimately coming to Jesus. So I believe that these references or sayings attributed to Confucius and to Chinese philosophy over periods of hundreds or thousands of years show that what Paul is talking about in Romans 2 is true. It's not just a statement that we have in Paul and we say, okay, well, we'll just go with that, you know, and then that would be enough. I mean, we do accept Paul as one who was directly converted by Christ. He was involved in the early congregations. He wrote numerous letters and dealt with those who followed Jesus directly, like Peter and others. So it's not like we suspect Paul. But having an example in another culture, like Confucius or Confucianism, that shows us that what Jesus said was the second greatest commandment was actually being practiced by this culture, and by this Chinese culture over hundreds or even thousands of years, where many people think there's not been any Christian or Jah exposure. That's not true. That's not true. And one of the most famous writers, certainly most plentiful and famous writers of the New Testament records, Paul, is talking about just that. So think more broadly in terms of your appreciation for other people and cultures, without necessarily accommodating them in terms of compromising your own. We certainly accommodate in the sense of trying to be all things to all people, but we also draw a line, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We don't fall down and worship before a false god, but we can show honor. We can be honoring to even people's cultures and ways that we do not agree with. That's the whole point. Even Paul says, show honor to those who demand it. But we also do what God tells us above and beyond what humans do if it's necessary. If it's not necessary, then we should try to set an example, so we should gain as many as possible. But by treating others the way we want to be treated, we're going to have a good chance of accomplishing just that, because it's very difficult to make enemies if you're being consistent with your behavior. Unfortunately, we're not perfect and we make mistakes, so we do have to deal with consequences, or we have to try to become better people. Just because we fail to treat someone the way we should have treated them, well, that's not good. But then if you're feeling bad about it and you're willing to put in the time and effort to become a better person, then we have to be accepting of other people. I see such a lack of acceptance in places where I often don't expect it. I'm not going to get specific because I'm not here to point out things like that today. But what I'm getting at is that we can still be devoted to Christ and to Jah without compromising that loyalty or our worship, and work with people who are demonstrating that in their hearts they're following something very similar, if not identical, to what Jesus says is the second greatest command next to worshiping Jah. So keep these things in mind and try to share them so that people have a better appreciation for the history, not only of the Golden Rule from the biblical writings, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and it's also referred to in some of the New Testament letters. But I wanted to focus on Jesus today as the direct source of the information. So when you go to someone like Paul quoting Jesus, it's a secondhand information, and it's relevant and valuable because he's from the first century and obviously would have heard and learned from others the things that Jesus said and did. But, you know, when you're dealing with Confucius, as I talked about, you're often dealing with third, fourth, fifth hand information. But it's not really critical for us to establish whether the form of the Golden Rule that we talked about regarding Confucius is from him or not. It's a part of Confucianism, Neo-Confucianism, and it goes back hundreds, if not thousands of years as an influencing philosophy of Chinese culture. And so we're not the only ones. We are not the only ones who have been benefiting by this principle. And we should keep that in mind. Jah's very active. His spirit is in every single one of us, every single human alive. And so that's how he knows what their inner thoughts are. And that's how he knows what our inner thoughts are. And he will be the one to determine if we or they are accused or excused on the day of Christ Jesus. So I thank you all for joining me today. And I tried to include some of the questions and information as a part of my discussion so that we could cover as much ground within the time that I try to keep these broadcasts to, which is about 45 minutes. Sometimes we'll go a little longer. It is a Saturday live talk show, but it depends. It depends on the subject. So in closing, let me just say a few things. Now, there are going to be a couple changes to the Great Message. I will put up later today the Great Message number 3 on Jesus and the historical information that I talked about in CWJah Talk 3 last Saturday. And I've just been editing that to get the photos and the timing right. You'll see what I mean. We're trying to get the photos to time and be sequenced with what I say. And so it's coming out okay, but it's we're trying different things, and we want to give you all the best presentation possible so that you're benefited by it and you can share it with others. And so that's now, once I put the Great Message 3 up later today, and I'll put a copy of this broadcast up as well, there's not going to be like an every week Great Message as I originally intended. I may do them once a week, I may do them more than once a week, or I may do them once a month. So the Great Message will now become a more special type presentation based on a topic, and I will always include information, visual information. So it's a different type of show. And eventually I will also do the live broadcast here with a split screen and also be showing different things, probably review various articles or just show texts that I'm discussing or that we'll get into a little bit more. So I have a lot of different ideas I'm going to be using and ways to get us more into the subjects that we talk about. And I will be in the future branching out a little more onto some more mainstream topics. I've tried to keep it kind of just focused on Christian witnesses of Jah, the Bible, Jesus, and the 3 things, so that I could lay a foundation, get the channel well established in terms of what I want to be known for. This is what I'm here to do. I'm not here to gain fame or fortune, but I'm here to do the best I can and help you. But I will be branching out to give the message overall more notoriety. But I will pick the subjects and topics that I feel are most appropriate to tie in with the Bible or with the timely warning. And this will then lead to various subjects that I think will be more current. Whereas, to this point, we've been talking more about history and our teachings and certain applications we make, but topically, I haven't really gotten into too many current issues yet, but we will. So I've enjoyed these shows so far. Thank you all very much. I really appreciate the time that we spend together. I will be back Monday, 5 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, for another day text as we work our way through the book of Colossians and the rest of the New Testament. And then I will be back again next Saturday for CWJah Talk number 5. Stay tuned for the title of that talk show. And like I said, later today, Great Message number 3 will be online. So I hope you enjoy it. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and may Jah bless you. Thank you.